think everyone has heard of polio. It is a highly contagious viral infection that can lead to paralysis, breathing problems, and even death. In his 1944 novel Nemesis, the author Philip Roth described polio this way. Finally, the cataclysm began. The monstrous headache, enfeebling exhaustion, the severe nausea, the raging fever, the unbearable muscle ache followed in another 48 hours by the paralysis. In the past, a polio epidemic appeared each summer in at least one part of the United States. Newspapers published the names and addresses of people identified with the disease. Quarantine placards were nailed to their doors. Swimming pools and movie theaters were closed. Images of children on crutches and hospital wards full of patients in iron lungs were seen. No one was safe. And now today, polio in the United States is virtually unknown. So as the world deals with the COVID pandemic, what can we learn from the polio epidemic of the past? And what vaccinations efforts worked and why did they work? But first, if you were wondering why, we put a picture of Elvis Presley getting a shot on our promotional materials. Here's why. So in 1956, Elvis Presley was on the precipice of global stardom. Love Me Tender, his debut film, was going to be released in November. And in October, Elvis was booked as a guest on the most popular TV show at the time, The Ed Sullivan Show. And we are all way too young to remember any of this. At that time, the polio virus had been ravaging America for years, and tens of thousands of children were affected annually. So before the show started, in front of the press and Ed Sullivan himself, Presley flashed his swoon-worthy smile, rolled up his sleeve, and let a New York State health official stick a needle loaded up with the polio vaccine into his arm. In just 6 months, the polio vaccination rate among American teenagers went from 0.6% to more than 80%, and researchers give Elvis most of the credit. So let's hear about polio, the vaccine, and the effort to eradicate this disease from the planet. This evening, we'll be visiting with a panel of 4 guests. Our panel includes Dr. René Najera, Dr. Chris Crenner, Carl Chenery, and Jim Arnett. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you very much for taking time this evening to be here with us. So I want to remind you or let you know that in the chat section, there is a link to our catalog. If you click on that link, it will take you to a bibliography of polio-related materials that are available in our catalog for checkout. And also, if you need to switch to speaker view, that will eliminate the gallery of everyone's pictures and black boxes and let you see the PowerPoint presentations more easily. So after we have talked with all of our panelists, there will be a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions, type them into the chat area and those will be forwarded to me. So we will begin our program this evening with Dr. René Najera, and I hope I got your name right.
Pretty close, not bad at all. Hi.
Okay, all right. So René is a graduate at the University of Texas, El Paso, George Washington University, and the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he received his Doctor of Public Health. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at George Mason University, Department of Global and Community Health, and he is an associate in the Department of Epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He works as an epidemiologist at the Fairfax County Health Department in Virginia, and he is also the editor of the History of Vaccines Project, an informational and educational website created by the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. He has worked as a consulting epidemiologist for the Anne Arundel Health Department in Maryland and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He helped update their Ebola response guidelines and infectious disease investigation guidelines. He worked with the CDC during the Zika outbreak response in Puerto Rico. And he has been a source of great information during the COVID pandemic. And from what I can tell, you've been giving lots of interviews and presentations. So thank you very much for taking time this evening to share with us about polio. I turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, we've been a little bit busy with this pandemic. Hopefully it'll prepare us for the next one, right? So tonight I'm going to keep it short. Excuse me, a little bit of a sore throat. but I've been fully vaccinated against COVID, so I should be fine. A little bit of a presentation on the history of polio, just a few slides, just a few factoids, things that you'll hopefully find interesting, and then we'll move into the one of the other speakers will talk about the vaccine itself. So I'm not going to go too deep into the vaccine, just give you some of the background information on what led towards the development of the vaccine. So without further ado, this is a tablet from Egypt. Excuse me. And it's one of the earliest descriptions of polio, or somebody with polio. And how do we know that this person had polio? If you look at their right leg, which is towards the left on your screen, it's a little bit atrophied. It's a little bit skinny. Not as strong, not as big as the left leg. And so this is believed to be somebody who suffered from polio, and their leg was paralyzed. And when your leg gets paralyzed, the muscles don't work. And when the muscles don't work, they atrophy, right? If you don't use them, you lose them. And so this is one of the earliest instances of this. Other depictions of polio in history appear, but there's nobody that actually sits down and says, there's this disease that looks like this. That wouldn't come until the early 1800s. And this is a poet, a Scottish poet, who when he got sick, it was called a teething paralysis, because it happened around the time when he was teething, when he was a young boy. And he was one of the first ones to have his disease fully explained from beginning to end. So when he caught it, his signs and symptoms, and it was known as different ways. It wasn't known as polio per se. It was known as paralysis, infantile paralysis, teething paralysis. Paralysis keeps coming up because that is what happened to the worst of the cases, is that they got paralyzed, one limb, two limbs, and then unfortunately some of them would get paralyzed and they wouldn't be able to breathe and would die. And so it was believed that this infection or this disease had some sort of an infectivity to it, but it wasn't quite clear. This is before the era of germ theory, when scientists kind of discovered that diseases could be transmitted by a sort of an infection, a bacteria and a virus, although they didn't quite were able to see the virus yet. And so this is one of the earliest instances of that. And then in the mid to late 1800s, there's some clusters, not full-on outbreaks, but just groups of people beginning in Louisiana, then in Boston, and then in Vermont, who develop this kind of paralytic syndrome, where they have a flu-like illness, and then a few days later they get paralyzed in different ways. It could be, again, one or two limbs, it could be all the limbs, it could be paralyzed to the point of not being able to breathe and die. And so it's not until it happens in Vermont that is kind of the first outbreak that is fully described in the literature, that they actually say this is where it began, this is the likely source of infection, and at the time, everybody pointed to some sort of water, or something to do with people coming together around water, because it tended to happen in the summertime. And so it was not until then that it was described as an infection, or an outbreak, if you will. And so it happens in Vermont, and it gets fully explained. 100 or so people get sick. And like you mentioned in the introduction, this is in New York, 1909. By then, polio comes into the big cities. You get people together in big groups of people in the cities, and diseases travel very, very fast. We were seeing it now with COVID. We've seen it with flu. Congregate settings, people coming together with each other. And so this is from New York City. This is a placard that would be put on the home of somebody with infantile paralysis. I'm gonna just go ahead and read it for you. An act of assembly approved May 14th, 1909, provides that anyone violating the provisions of this act, upon conviction thereof, may be sentenced to pay a fine of no less than $10 or more than $100, to be paid to the use of said county, or to be imprisoned in the county jail for a period of no less than 10 days or more than 30 days, or both, at the discretion of the court. So this is basically telling people, stay out. Let's try to stop the infection. You know, if you're sick, you're staying home, and if you're not, don't come in. You know, we see it now with quarantines. This is kind of the ultimate quarantine, right, where you face some stiff penalties if you don't follow it. Excuse me. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, during World War II, and slightly a few years before that, he developed polio late in his life. He was 39 years old when he went off the coast of Maine with his family on a family vacation, and he fell ill with what was understood to be polio. There is some controversy. Some papers recently, looking back on it, have said that this was actually Guillain-Barré syndrome, another similar kind of neurological disorder that happens with viral infections. But you know, people who were there and treated him and had seen polio firsthand. I don't know of a lot of physicians nowadays that have seen polio firsthand. Especially the younger ones, but you know, they saw it. They saw him. They treated him, and he you know, he had all the signs and symptoms of polio, and he was left weakened by it, not fully paralyzed. You know, you see some of the images from World War II in particular, and he's up and moving. You know, and he made it his life's work, among all the other things that had to be done at the time with the Great Depression and then with World War II, to kind of fund the drive towards getting to the vaccine. And so he was, you know, just like we talk about Elvis being an influencer when it comes to the vaccine. Well, FDR was like the ultimate influencer in getting somewhere with polio research. This is a graph showing the prevalence of polio in the United States, cases per 100,000. The blue line or darker line, depending on your monitor, is a number of cases, and then the red line is a number of deaths. So you'll see that there was a spike in 1916. That's when a major epidemic happened in the United States and in big cities, mostly on the East Coast, mostly in New York City. Up to 2,000 children died that year in New York City. You can imagine how horrifying that must be, right? That you have these children that, you know, when a child falls into a well, we all come together to get that child out of the well. We do our darnest to protect our children, and 2,000 dead in a city, that's got to be horrifying. These epidemics continued periodically in the first half of the 20th century. You see it there, and then you have major epidemics from 1940 to 1960. And they end, right? They go away, and spoiler alert, they go away because of the polio vaccine. So these are some of the numbers that were tracked at the time. You have to keep in mind that this might be an underestimate. Why? Because not everybody who gets infected with polio gets paralytic polio. About 95% of people who get infected with polio, they recover. They don't have any major signs or symptoms of it. And then in the 5% that do get like this more acute polio, they can get what is called aseptic meningitis, viral meningitis. And then 1% of the infected actually go on to develop paralysis. The older you are, the more weak you are because of other diseases or because of malnutrition, things like that, the worse off you will be if you get infected with polio. But for the most part, you know, 95% of people who get it recover. It's just that those 5% are still, you know, a lot. If you give it to every child, then you're going to have a lot of children who will be injured. And so, you know, these cases just periodically came and went, mostly in the summer. Why? Because in the summer, you know, children are getting together. But there was good evidence also that it wasn't just the summer. It was also during the school year when children were getting together and giving it to each other. This is the virus. This is what the virus looks like. There are three strains of it. The strains 1, 2, and 3 to simplify it. 2 and 3 have been eradicated. They are no longer circulating in the human population. Humans are the only animals that can carry the polio virus, which makes it a good candidate or a perfect candidate for eradication. The one strain that's left in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I believe we're going to talk about it later on today. And so, you know, it's infectious from person to person. This is another micrograph, another way of looking at the viruses. They're little round viruses. Infectious from person to person it's called the fecal oral route. So basically you have to eat it, you have to consume it in some way, and then you excrete it and that's how it's passed to another person. So poor hygiene, contaminated water, contaminated food, food that is not cooked properly, and somebody who has polio prepares it. You know, the kind of thing that we watch out for now with a lot of other diseases would have been perfect to control polio back then. Sanitation, water sanitation, etc. So the polio virus goes through your mucosa and the digestive system. It goes to the lymph nodes and it travels to the spinal cord, and that's where it causes damage. It multiplies in the spinal cord and the neurons, and it destroys them, and that's what leads to the paralysis. And again, not everybody has that phase of the virus traveling to the motor neurons, to the spinal cord, but those who do are the ones that we see that have the paralysis. Here's the phases of polio. Elementary phase, it enters you ingest it through your mouth, goes to the small intestine, then you excrete it. Lymphatic phase, it travels outside of the alimentary canal, outside of the digestive system, it travels to the lymph nodes, and then it goes into the viremic phase. Not everybody experiences full-on viremia, but when you do, it travels to other parts of the body, and that's how it gets to the neurons and becomes the neural phase, where it actually causes the damage to the neurons. So this is, again, looking at those rates, but with actual numbers, right? And so in 1916, that epidemic, you had almost 28,000 or so cases with about 8,000 deaths. So that's a very high rate of death per case. And again, it might be a gross underestimate because you probably are not counting the cases of people who are asymptomatic. But you know, if you look at if this 28,000 represents 5%, then you can imagine what the 100% would be. It would be up in the hundreds of thousands, right? Almost 500,000. So or more. And so, you know, very, very serious, very high burden of disease, especially in communities where, again, people are living congregated, people can't get away from each other to contain it. This is just some early illustrations of trying to describe the burden of the disease in the United States. You have here the 50 US states. Hawaii is over there to the left. And so, you know, they just did some estimates, did some quick counts, and you see it. It was in every state in the country. It just traveled because people travel as well. And so it just traveled from person to person. And here's another graph of the incidence of cases and rainfall, because again, they would usually see the cases rise in the summer. And so one of the theories was it must be the rainfall. There must be something there, probably having to do with warmer weather and getting out to going swimming, going to public pools, or drinking contaminated water. We see other diarrheal diseases in the summer because of contaminated water. And so that probably had a role in all of this. And so this is one of the last slides. You see the decade of the last recorded case of paralytic polio. So paralytic polio leaves Scandinavia, so Norway, Finland, up in that part of Europe in the 1950s. In the 1960s, with the vaccine, it leaves North America, Australia, the rest of Europe. In the 1970s and 80s, Latin America gets benefited from the elimination of polio. In the 1990s, the rest of Latin America, Mexico, Russia, China, parts of the Middle East, parts of Africa. In the 2000s and Africa, 2010s, and most recently, this is as of 2015, but most recently, in the last few years, Africa was declared to be polio free. And so now you only see it in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, which is over there by India, northwest of India, if you want to have a reference there. So yeah, the progress, it begins in the 1950s with the polio vaccine, and then it ends soon, right? It's still around, but it should be the second disease to be eradicated after smallpox. So that's what I have for you folks. I'm more than happy to take questions in the chat, or we can do some more questions in the Q&A at the end.
I think we'll take questions at the end. Thank you very much, Dr. Najera. That was very informative. I really appreciate it. Okay. I think we'll move on now to our next panelist, Dr. Christopher Crenner. Dr. Crenner is the Robert Hudson and Ralph Major Professor and Chair of the History and Philosophy of Medicine Department at the University of Kansas Medical Center. Dr. Crenner is a Princeton and Harvard graduate. He completed his residency at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where he was the Dunn Award winner, and he did his fellowship at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital. As chair of his department, he works with new physicians, enriching their learning experience to include the history of American medicine, especially the development of medical science and its impact on practice. His department organizes and leads ethics education for the medical students and residency programs, and he serves and it also serves in organizing the ethics committee for the hospital. He is the series editor for Rochester Studies in Medical History, published by the University of Rochester Press, and he is the recent past president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. He supervises the longitudinal primary care clinic for residents in the combined medicine psychiatry residency program, and then he is also a volunteer physician for the free JDoc Health Clinic in Kansas City, Kansas. Thank you very much, Dr. Crenner, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Laura, for the wonderful introduction. Let me pull up my slides here. And thank you to Dr. Najera for giving us a great introduction to what I want to talk about. I want to give you a very brief review of the steps that took place in understanding of the virus to lead up to the polio vaccine. This invitation was wonderful. I want to thank the Northeast Consortium of Libraries for the opportunity to talk with you. Thinking about the history of medicine and trying to make it valuable in our own understanding of the present day situation is that's my bread and butter. So this was a great chance for me to talk with you. I'm excited about it. So I'm going to walk through just a few of steps in the path that led us to being able to create a polio vaccine, and then think about how that relates to what we've seen with the COVID vaccine. And the story starts with the notion that polio is epidemic. And Dr. Najera already referred to this, the 1890s epidemics, one of them striking Vermont. And that was mostly identified and understood by this man, Dr. Caverly. He was a physician who trained in Vermont in the 1890s and became the president of the Vermont Public Health Association. And in his own clinical practice, he began to see cases of polio, and he was the first to understand it as an epidemic disease. An epidemic disease comes as an unusually high rate of disease in a specific area that is identified as new to the area. The contrasting term is endemic. You saw that maybe on Dr. Najera's last map, where in Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's endemic, means it's continuously there. Caverly identified polio as coming from outside, striking and creating a surge that then went away, which characterized an epidemic, and also gave us some of the first observations about the course of polio and how to identify it. That's the first step, right? You need to know what your enemy is. Then they had to find what the cause of it was. That actually took about 14 more years after the identification of polio's epidemic before Karl Landsteiner, who's a physician famous for the discovery of what's now called the ABO blood typing system. So if you're type A blood, that's because Dr. Landsteiner had understood that. He was able to isolate the polio virus. The technology was not available before his time. In 1908, they had a tool that I've illustrated here. It's called the Chamberlain filter. It's got a little porcelain tube in the center of a steel tube, you see there on the right. And viruses can pass through porcelain because they're so small, but all the other contaminants and bacteria would be screened out. So he was able to show that this wasn't a bacterium, it was much smaller, a virus, and that it could be filtered and then reliably reinfect he was using animal models, reinfect animals with the same disease. So then we had 14 years later, we had an epidemic disease, we had the agent. And then as a historian of science, I know we always take some little side steps in the course of understanding something. And so the next phase was just a misstep by a very famous person who made many important contributions to medicine, but here seemed to have missed the boat a bit. Simon Flexner was the director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Science in the early part of the 20th century. In 1909, he did some important work that misunderstood how polio was passed into the body. He believed that polio came in through the nasal passages and then directly into the nervous system. And you saw in Dr. Najera's diagram of what we now understand to be the path of polio, that it comes in through the digestive system, and there's a period of viremia when it's in the blood. So Flexner's belief that it skipped the phase of being in the blood and went directly to the spinal cord and brain to cause damage. That led to people to suspect that it wouldn't be possible to create a vaccine for polio. And so it was a long pause where there was not much work based on this, by this sort of little detour we took. Next step in sort of the unfolding of this problem was taken by Dorothy Horstman. Dr. Horstman was a very important microbiologist in the mid-20th century. And she really nailed down finally the pathophysiology of infection, demonstrating that the infection, as we now know, has a period of passing through the bloodstream, viremia in Dr. Najera's diagram. And after the viremic phase, then the virus enters the nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain, where it does its damage and paralysis. This immediately made it clear, now in the 1940s, as epidemics of polio are becoming more severe, that you could, a vaccine against the virus held some promise, because it would have to be able to attack the virus while it was in the bloodstream. She had a very important career even following this discovery, and went on to become the first woman to secure an endowed chair at Yale University, and a very influential scientist of her time. With this now, with it now clear that you could vaccinate against the virus, people began to work on it, a little hesitantly at first, but a really important step was taken then by Dr. Isabel Morgan. She made actually the very first successful prototype of a vaccine against polio, only in a monkey model. This was not tried on humans. And I wanted to highlight a couple people who aren't usually in the story here, two women scientists who sometimes get left off the map. They had done some critical work that was even more impressive because of some of the barriers that they faced in the 1950s to be women in science. And this is actually illustrated by Dr. Morgan's career. She developed this vaccine in monkeys. The next step would be to try to take it to humans. But because of her choice to marry and raise a family, she had to leave the laboratory. So she wasn't able to continue that work at the time, and other scientists had to pick it up. Very interestingly, she came from a wonderful family. Her father was Thomas Hunt Morgan, who's known as the person who sort of invented the whole field of experimental genetics using fruit flies. And her mother, also a scientist, Lillian Sampson, then Lillian Morgan, did important work in genetics as well. And just wonderfully, because she was the mother of another scientist, one of her breakthrough publications was on the transmission of the X chromosome, which identifies female genotypes through genetic change. So just a nice little sideline there. So the table is laid now. We know that this is an epidemic. We know by the 1950s that a vaccine would potentially be able to combat this disease. And really, it just took some hard work by a number of scientists to kind of perfect the human vaccine going forward from the stage. But given this opportunity, I don't want to miss a chance to plug one of our famous alums from the University of Kansas Medical School, who also had a hand in getting us to that final step. Dr. Louis Coriell, Dr. Louis Coriell demonstrated that an immune globulin, gamma globulin, similar to what's been used in convalescent serum, could combat the polio infection if it was administered in an early phase. Very similar to what they've been doing with convalescent serum and immunotherapy early in the course of COVID. He did that work in 1952. He was a graduate, one of the first graduates at KU Medical School with an MD and a PhD. And in 6 years, he sort of simultaneously completed both degrees, kind of a wonder kid, and wanted to have quite an illustrious career in virology. That kind of brought us right up to the final step, which many of you would know as the famous Salk vaccine trials in 1954. And Coriell actually was one of the field trial administrators for this enormous nationwide trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of what became the first successful polio vaccine, the Salk killed virus vaccine in 1954, then approved for wide use in 1955. And it followed later by the Sabin vaccine. There's so many ways you could tell this story. I kind of picked a few examples with the idea to line them up in concluding with what we've watched happen with the creation of a successful COVID vaccine. So we started with finding out that polio was an epidemic in 1894. It really matches up with the Wuhan Municipal Health Department's announcement of an infectious epidemic disease of COVID in December, at the end of December in 2019. Then, the next step, as we talked about, was understanding its transmission. I mentioned Dorothy Horstman demonstrating the viremia in 1946. Well, it only took about 10 days before the World Health Organization was notifying us that this was a aerosol, a respiratory virus that was transmittable from human to human. So, and probably known even earlier than that in China. So very, very quickly, didn't take the 4 decades that it had previously. A prototype vaccine, 1950, by Isabel Morgan for animals. Phase 1 trials of COVID for Moderna in July of 2020 and August for Pfizer in 2020. And then we had a proof of an effective vaccine, as I said, in 1954 for the Salk vaccine with the field trials, in 1960 for the Sabin, which would be Moderna in November, just a few months after the phase 1 trials, successful phase 3 trials, and just 4 days later for the Pfizer in 2020. So I just love the juxtaposition of these two vaccine development things, because it really, you can see 60 years from start to finish for polio, but only 11 months for COVID. So something to celebrate and really take great pride in, of the science that went into this. Lots more to say, of course. I thought I would just give you a little taste and go on to our next speaker, but we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crenner. That was really interesting to hear about the evolution of the vaccine and all the contributors to the ultimate vaccine. You always hear Dr. Salk and Sabin, but there was a number of people who laid the groundwork for their eventual work. So thank you very much. All right, we will now move on to a couple of gentlemen from the Rotary Club. The Rotary is dedicated to, I guess I could say they're dedicated to eradicating this virus off the planet. It is a huge, huge service project for the Rotary International. So we have 2 gentlemen from the Rotary, Jim Arnett and Carl Chenery. We're going to start with Jim Arnett.
Nope, Carl.
Okay. And he
Start
gave.
with-
Huh?
Is Carl going to go first? I thought.
Is Carl going to go first?
Yep.
So we're going to start with Carl. So Carl is what we're going to speak with first. He is the past district governor from the Rotary District 6040, and he's a member of the Lee Summit Rotary Club, and he has had extensive involvement with the Rotary Service Project known as PolioPlus. So welcome, Mr. Chenery, and looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. And Dr. Najera and Crenner have done a good job of laying the groundwork in describing what polio is and its history. Stories make events, and in this case, the polio virus, come alive. So my story is, let us go back to mentally transport ourselves back to 1942 and enter the home and life of one family. The home belongs to a couple named George and Artis Chenery and their 5 young boys. George, age 9, Bill, age 7, Richard, age 5, Larry, age 4, and Carl, age 1. They live in the middle of Kansas City. And I want to read a letter written by the mother, my mother, when she was 89 years old, describing the events of that year. Dear Carl, this is very hard for me, but you asked me, and just maybe it will help someone else. It must have been August 7th, 1942, when Bill came in and announced he had poliomyelitis. I didn't know where he had heard of such, but I said, if you have poliomyelitis, you go straight up to bed and stay there. And he did. He really did feel bad. We did the usual things to care of a sick person. He stayed in bed at least a couple of days, and then George became ill. I called Dr. Eldridge, our pediatrician, and he came several times, but didn't give the illness a name until the night of August 11th. George couldn't swallow his medication. It came back up through his nose. I called the doctor again and he came right over. Dad was on the road selling. I don't remember who stayed with the others, but Dr. Eldridge, George, and me to Old General Hospital. They took George, but wouldn't let me stay at all. No other hospital in Kansas City would accept us. I sputtered, but they wouldn't even let me go with George. I went home and called Dad. He started home immediately, drove all night, and went to the hospital about 4 a.m. But they wouldn't let him in either. He came home, and at about 7 a.m., the hospital called us and said George was dying, to come immediately, which we did. When we arrived, George was already gone. He was tied to the bed, feet at each corner of the bed, hands over his head and fastened at each corner, stripped naked. We stayed in his room as long as they would let us, and of course, Dad had to make arrangements, which he did. I firmly believe George probably would have passed away anyway, as he had bulbar polio, the most virulent strain, and probably choked on his own juices. However, I will always believe the treatment he received at the hospital killed him just as much as the disease. I believe he was frightened to death and will always think so. By that time, Richard, Larry, and Carl had also become sick. And when I got home from the hospital, Richard was much worse, and we rushed him to the hospital. When we marched in, I informed them I was staying. I had lost one child and I was staying no matter what. Well, I did. I don't remember how long, but Dad and I took turns. So Richard always had one of us there. One of Dad's aunts had come to help us and stayed with Bill, Larry, and Carl. Carl was an infant and stayed in his bed crib much of the time. An intern was watching Richard and doing a pretty good job. Dad sent someone to get me to go to the funeral home to see George, but I wasn't able to stay for the funeral. When I got back to the hospital, Richard wasn't doing well. And in the night, during the intern's coffee break, I saw Richard's skin sink into his chest. All I could see were bones covered with skin drawn tight. I ran as fast as I could down the hall, calling the intern. He joined me and we ran back to Richard, and this man picked Richard up and plunked him into an iron lung. He didn't even get ready. However, he didn't fight it, but breathed along with it. His lungs had collapsed. The radio stations throughout Kansas City put out a call for anyone who had had polio to please go to the hospital and give blood to save this little boy's life. One young man or boy answered it and gave his blood. We never did see the boy or have any idea who he was. He had walked miles to help someone he had never heard of before. I am most grateful to this unknown person. Richard was whiter than this paper and failing. The machine was breathing for him, but when they started giving him the boy's blood, it was like a perfect miracle. His skin gradually started turning the most beautiful pink anyone has ever seen, and he started coming back. I don't remember how long we were at the hospital, but they treated us much better. When we went home, we had to start the kidney treatments. There was one nurse at Old Children's Mercy Hospital who would give us the treatments if Dad would go after her and take her back 3 times a week. Since it was wartime, gasoline was rationed, and we didn't have enough gas stamps. But people we had never heard of, and some we knew quite well, gave us stamps so we could get this nurse. We had to have a 100% wool blanket to tear into strips and put in boiling water, run through a tight wringer and place on each child for so many minutes, then off for so many minutes, then on, etc. Dad put a hot plate in the upstairs bathroom to boil the water. Put an old wringer over the tub with the stacks of 100% wool strips handy. Bill had done better and was on his way to recovery. But Richard, Larry, and Carl were the sick ones now. Dad hired nurses to help during the day, and my dear mother drove from Concord, California to help. When the boys were well enough, we had to start therapy, compliments of the March of Dimes. This is just one example of what families went through when polio struck. People came from everywhere to give us hope and offer to help, but they couldn't come in the house because of the quarantine. It took 60 years for my mother to write this letter and to talk about polio. My dad never did. That is the legacy of polio, and we must not forget. While polio has been eradicated for decades from many parts of the world, my family's experience is recurring in places still, as you know, like Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 1979, Rotary was involved with the disease in the Philippines. And fortunately, a Canadian pharmaceutical company had some leftover vaccine, and Rotary was able to take it to the Philippines and inoculate 6 million children under 5 years old, and it was wiped out. And as a result of that, that trial and that experience and that success has been replicated over the world in what is called National Immunization Days. And if you could put up that slide real quickly. And I'll show you what a National Immunization Day involves. This is just one day, a massive effort to eradicate polio in India, as I said, on just one day. And this is what it takes on that one day to inoculate the children throughout the country. You'll see it at the bottom. It took 174 million children were immunized in one single day. And India has been successful in wiping it out as a result of giving these national immunization days, which they still do. So this is the way that we are able to be successful in different parts of the world. That's the history and the story of polio.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us, Carl. That's really the human side of this disease. We can learn a lot about it and the statistics and demographics and history, but it's the human toll that really breaks your heart. All right, our final speaker on our panel is Jim Arnett. Jim Arnett is Leawood Rotary Club's token rocket scientist, having retired from the California Institute of Technology's Jet Propulsion Lab after 35 years of designing, testing, and launching spacecraft for NASA. So Jim and his polio survivor spouse, Mary Ann, became involved in Rotary International's 30th anniversary celebration of PolioPlus in 2015. He currently serves as the polio ambassador for Rotary District 5710. Over the last 4 years, he has led the 45 Rotary clubs of Eastern Kansas to a record level in PolioPlus donations. With matching grants from Rotary International and the Gates Foundation, donations are now approaching $750,000. Jim is Leewood's Rotarian of the Year and recipient of Rotary International's Service Above Self Award. He will bring us up to date about the Rotary's PolioPlus efforts to eradicate polio while helping fight off COVID-19 worldwide. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, I'm sharing my slides. First of all, I want to thank the Northeast Kansas Libraries. I assume everybody can see those slides now. Thank you for inviting us to do this. Here's some things I want to talk about, a bit of the Rotary's polio history, some of which Carl has already covered. Let you know where our eradication efforts stand now, and how PolioPlus is currently working to support the COVID problems. People ask what the plus part of polio is all about, and then I'm going to talk about that and how Rotary in Kansas is doing this year. And some of you say, well, some of us who are not Rotarians may want to know how you can help eradicate polio. Echoing what Carl said, my wife also was a polio survivor in 1946, and she experienced the same sort of problems of separation from the family and friends that parallels today COVID victims. She went swimming at Swope Park and came down the next day and then ended up in having to be in 2 different hospitals, but went through the stress of seeing her parents through a glass window for 9 months, which was very problematical. She was supported by the March of Dimes, which helped pay for her aids and supplies and rehab for many years, well into the time when she was in high school. It was invaluable. She actually served as one of the March of Dimes kids, so that was kind of fun. More recently, the emergence of post-polio support groups throughout the country is helping a lot of people who have experienced polio and are currently now suffering these late effects. There's an estimate from CDC that there are probably somewhere 1.5 million polio survivors in the day. Some people never knew they had polio until they began to have those effects. And a lot of polio survivors have had a problem for many years getting places and going where it wasn't until the American with Disabilities Act came along and we really got some help from that. So that in keeping in mind, let's go on and talk a little bit about how this happened. As Carl said, polio did vaccinate the kids in the Philippines, and on the International Convention, which was held in 1985 in Kansas City, the keynote speaker was Dr. Sabin. At that point, he looked back at history and saw that we had done in the Philippines and said, stop talking about polio, go ahead and eradicate it. Well, Carlos Cancero, who was the president of Rotary at that time, said, yeah, we'll do that. At that point, there are 365,000 cases a year were occurring. And the work of PolioPlus, which began then, was joined by an organization that consisted of UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and a number of other countries, called the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. It was organized. Since then, over 2.5 billion children in over 200 countries have already been immunized, which is an amazing statistic. So here's where we are right now. This is important because last year, in the 2 endemic countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, it was really ticked up. As you can see, back in 2018, we're down to 33, then it went up. This year, at this same time, there have been 27 cases in those 2 countries, but so far this year, we're well into it. There's only been 2 cases, and in part that's because, in spite of the COVID activities that have caused us to stop doing some of the national immunization days, we've actually been able to go ahead and begin the revaccination programs in both of those countries. There were a major effort in February in Afghanistan, and basically both those countries are doing very well. There is another problem, which you can see from the substantial number there in the line that says what are called circulating vaccine-derived cases. There were 1,086. This is a situation where the oral polio virus, which has been given around the world now, which is the Sabin vaccine, it will mutate if it's given to people that are in areas where there is somewhat bad sanitation or hunger. And the mutation then causes a very similar case that looks a lot like the wild polio virus. But it took, what it has to happen is that we have now begun to give what is called a novel oral polio virus, which is a new version the World Health Organization has put forward that will not mutate. So we're hopeful we're going to be able to get some control into that. Then moving on, we want to talk a little bit about what's happened with the COVID and how PolioPlus is helping that. The global push for ending polio all around the world has created a really important infrastructure in many, many places. Experienced volunteers and people who've worked with the Global Polio Initiative have become really the backbone of responding to COVID-19, especially in those underdeveloped countries. Within a couple of weeks after the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic, the GPAI immediately pivoted a lot of the people over to supporting and transferring people to work specifically helping attack the problems of the COVID disease. The experience that the people that have worked in the PolioPlus have had in finding and responding to the environmental evidence of the wild polio virus was immediately started to be used to track down the hotspots and in fact send medical response to the areas where the COVID it was showing up. Specifically, some of the things that that we've done that PolioPlus has supported some of the volunteers, they took some certain actions. We've added the symptoms that people would recognize COVID-19 to a list of disease symptoms that we typically watch for in areas where we're trying to track the wild polio virus. We've assigned people that are responsible for controlling and tracking the clusters to go out, find those cases and actually do a lot of the contact tracing. This has always been a problem to get enough people to help with the contact tracing when the COVID hotspots occur. That's true even here in the United States, as you know. So we have laboratories that are capable of doing analysis to verify which variants are cropping up in different places. And so we begin to collect and ship the samples to the PolioPlus laboratories that are around the world. There's specific locations that are capable of doing that kind of analysis. And we very much used what is an existing, pretty sophisticated network of social education to counteract misinformation about vaccines in general, and also to educate health workers about COVID-19 symptoms and how to deal with that and how to prevent it. Meanwhile, we still trying to continue to restart our polio fight, as we did as I mentioned earlier, at the earlier slide, where we begin to start doing national immunization days in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which have given us the results of such a low number so far this year. In fact, if we propagate the number we have so far to the end of the year, we're going to be well down less than 100 cases this year. And we will need to get down to the point where we have no cases in those two countries for 3 years before we can declare this disease eliminated. So people want to know sometimes, so now we're doing all that at the same time. People say, well, what is this PolioPlus all about? We try to talk about it. We try to tell you some of the things that the PolioPlus does. It's not just getting out. Oops. So some of the things we do, we actually create jobs by giving people in the countries where polio has existed, give them jobs to build equipment like wheelchairs and things of that type that they need. Rotary guarantees the access to clean water, installing water systems and filter systems in many places, improving the sanitation systems. We've actually built medical facilities and clinics in some of these locations. This is especially true in Africa and was very successful in helping Africa get to be completely free of the wild polio virus. We've been providing grants to pay off the loans that some underdeveloping countries have taken just to be able to purchase and pay for the polio vaccine. Another thing we've been doing on a regular basis, at the same time we've been giving the polio vaccine, we've been adding vitamin A drops. And that's an amazing thing because we estimate that it probably presented 1.25 million deaths by decreasing children's susceptibility to those diseases. And that plus is basically the health system infrastructure, not just the vaccines. And that infrastructure even helped stop the spread of Ebola. And right now it's continuing to fight the spread of COVID around the world. Excuse me. So there are still some opportunities for PolioPlus that exist. If we look back since 1985, when we began PolioPlus, the combination of the Rotary clubs with the Bill and Melinda Gates matching funds that we've been putting out there have donated almost $2.5 billion to PolioPlus. Separate from that, the very fact of Rotary doing that has encouraged many, many countries to go ahead and step forward. And up to this point, it's estimated that almost $18 billion has been donated from a variety of sources, both countries and non-governmental agencies, to go ahead and fight to eradicate polio. That currently, Rotary is working with a challenge that was given to us by the Gates Foundation for every dollar given by a Rotary Club or submitted, the Gates Foundation adds $2 more to it. So we think over the next 3 years, we're going to see another $450 million put into this activity. Just to remind you, we have to get to 0 cases in those 2 countries for at least 3 years to be able to say, hey, we've really eradicated polio. In order to do that, we've got to do some really important things. We have to vaccinate at least 400 million kids every year. Got to hire a lot of workers, probably 150,000, in addition to many volunteers. Some of the Rotarians from our country have gone around the world. In fact, I don't know how many times Carl has, but I know he's been on some of the National Immunization Days himself. We have to constantly improve how we find the locations where this disease exists and immediately go into those areas and provide the vaccines that are going to stop it from spreading more. Last year, the Rotary clubs in your part of the whole eastern half of Kansas donated over $103,000, and recognizing that's going to be matched by the Gates Foundation. And this year, in fact, the Rotary International Foundation itself adds another $1. So every dollar given to a Rotary club in Northeast Kansas to help raise funds for PolioPlus is going to actually turn into about $6. So we're working very hard. This year, if you have a Rotary club in your own town, near one of the libraries, you probably have seen them advertising or conducting fundraisers for this PolioPlus drive that we've been having. I hope that you've seen those, and so far we're off to a pretty good start doing that. Oh, now, I want to let you know where you can find some more information about what Rotary is doing to do this. If you will go there to End Polio Now, www.endpolio.org, you can find some information. And also, you heard me talk about the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. They are monitoring and helping us distribute these funds in an appropriate way. Check with that. But what I'd like to ask you as Kansans, if you would support your local Rotary Club, donate. In the coming months, they'll be holding fundraising events to support this battle. Much of the money goes to maintain that infrastructure that's out there that is actually working to combat the battle against polio and also the battle against COVID worldwide. Especially if you know someone who had polio, share their stories, as Carl has shared his story with us today. Encourage them to join one of the regional polio survivors groups. I put them in the list here on the slide, but I will also put them in the chat space if anybody is looking. I did see earlier, I think Jerry Venter was looking for some support. Jerry, you can get in touch with me. If anybody can, I'll also put my own, email into the chat also. And if you're out there, please donate to Rotary. I like to end these talks a little bit by simply saying, as Bill Gates did when he began to give us this funds to match it, we're achingly close to getting rid of polio. more than 99.9% of the way there. Finishing the job is a big challenge. It's very doable if we keep up the effort and keep working. Thank you, and I'm happy to, if we've got a few minutes left still, to answer any questions, and I know the rest of the panel would like to do that too.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was fascinating. And you can't overstate how important it is creating this infrastructure of jobs and roads and clinics and sanitation. For, as Dr. Najera talked about, it's the next disease. It's coming down the pipeline. We're creating infrastructure to fight it, as we are, as you said, we're fighting COVID too. So I have a couple of questions in the chat that I've been told about. One person has asked if someone could explain what post-polio syndrome is and what are the symptoms. Anybody want to take that?
I think one of the doctors probably should take it. Of course, my wife has post-polio. Let me just say that what it is, polio survivors, many of them worked very hard to have a normal life. They worked, in fact, almost every one of them are type A personalities. They tried extra hard. They did things that probably stressed the remaining neurons that had not been damaged. It's my understanding that the smaller neurons tries to take over the work in the muscles that are not working. Those are, if you're in your 70s or 80s, or even a little older, they're starting to wear out. So now that's a problem. And many of the polio survivors, the survivors have this new disease. It's really a symptom of their earlier having had polio, called post-polio syndrome. Docs, I think Dr. Najera maybe would tell us a little bit more about.
I defer to Dr. Crenner. I'm not a physician, so
Okay.
that's probably
Jim,
left for a physician.
Jim, you did a wonder. You characterized.
Yeah, that was very
exactly.
good.
That's yeah. I mean, it is difficult to define because people have all kinds of later troubles, but it looks like it's a very clear-cut thing for maybe a quarter of people. The definition is to have these diminished functions more than 15 years after initially having polio, and then developing new weaknesses that are progressive. So it's a very it's such a tragic thing after someone who had earlier polio to later in life have sort of subsequent effects of it. It's usually treated with kind of just supportive therapy with exercise and kind of other kinds of life adjustments.
I think someone offered the statistic. We have like over 1 million people, 1,400,000 people they think are polio survivors, and
that was a statistic. I got that number from the CDC estimate, and it's pretty close. But like I say, a lot of them don't realize that they've had it until it begins to be late in life. Those who knew they had polio were almost expecting it to happen. And if you look in the chat room, I've listed the four number of major people that can help. Invite you to join any of these groups. Marianne and I belong to all of them. I will say this, she did amazingly well until she accidentally fell down a flight of stairs, and up until that time had no problem. So apparently it was like a triggering mechanism sometimes, which I've talked to some of the other survivors that they were doing fine until they'd either broken a bone or had something like that. Then all of a sudden it really began to hit them.
Do you have any other questions? I don't want to keep our panelists too long.
Yeah, let me just quickly put my phone number and website in the chat place for everybody. Happy to talk to anyone about what's going on, or if you want to join one of the groups, I'll be glad to help you do that. And of course, most of the Rotarians know how to get in touch with me. That's and then my phone number. Whoops, two. I'm a slow typist.
I was going to ask, one of the questions I also got was there any type of anti-vax movement in the 50s, like we're seeing today with COVID, where people didn't trust the vaccine? They were reticent to get it.
Somebody want to mention about the Cutter affair that happened shortly after the vaccine trial started. but once we were past that, Marianne said that her observation was, of course, she did not get it because she had it in 1946. I recall everybody going. I mean, kids at schools, they all lined up. You know, it was not a problem.
Yeah, the people that had objections mostly based them on the Cutter incident, which was the Salk vaccine was based on a killed or not attenuated, a killed virus, and so the virus was not able to cause any disease, and the Cutter laboratory kind of missed a step and didn't kill the virus as well as they should have, and they caused some disease, and that caused a lot of consternation. A lot of the objections were more along the lines of some religious groups, and then just some, you know, fringe civil liberties. You can't tell me what to do with my child. But we're talking about children, and when it comes to children, it really, you know, people who live in that era saw what this could do, and they did not want that for their child, and so they were more than happy to get the children vaccinated. But anti-vaccine groups have always been around even before vaccines. When inoculation was the way to take care of smallpox, they were around to oppose that. A very small fragment of the population. They're very vocal, but they're not a big group. They know how to take advantage of communications and stuff. But when it comes to when it comes to actually seeing children sick and that happening, they kind of don't come out. And vaccines are a victim of their own success in that regards, right? We don't see measles like we used to. We don't see Haemophilus influenza, meningitis, things like that. And so because we don't see them, these groups now have a little bit more of attention getting more than anything. But I assure you that if we were, knock on wood, hopefully we won't, they would not, you know, I don't know of any parent who would tolerate that kind of stuff. So
Was there any economic or racial disparities back in that vaccination effort in the US in the 1950s?
Well, the March of Dimes basically at that time was really paying for an awful lot of the vaccines to be out there. So that since it was already paid for the most part, people were not having it. It was more of a, can you get to the place they were being given? And
Yeah.
is the real.
Yeah, and this is shortly after Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah.
So there's still segregation, but not as, I mean, it's the beginning of integration is happening. So when they partner up with schools, obviously there's going to be some sort of segregation there. And then, you know, not just in this country, but in many other countries, it's about socioeconomics and access. And so, yeah, it was about getting there. It was about knowing about it or being told that this was needed, et cetera. And so that was more of the disparity there. And we see it even today with COVID.
I'd like to comment that in Afghanistan and Pakistan, one of the biggest problems that we've had out there is that for whatever reason, the Taliban felt for religious purposes that somehow the United States was involved in the delivery of the vaccines, even to and so they actually have, I think the number we've actually lost to Taliban attacks have actually killed 27 of our workers in that country. They continue to work with them, and the education process is broken through somewhat, but it's a big problem. We have a lot of people in those two countries that they refuse for those reasons. So we're hopeful we can continue with correct the misinformation that's out there. We did have a case in Pakistan last year where an anti-vaxxer paid somebody to have a videotape of a child fainting when they got their vaccine and spread it around. And it resulted like 50,000 kids that month did not get their vaccine. So we've gone back to that area, and now it's been taken care of.
So I have a question here that somebody remembers getting a liquid vaccine, not an injection, a clear, tasteless drink, thanks when she was probably about 2 years of age. I remember getting a sugar cube.
Yeah. That's the Sabin vaccine. So after Salk, Albert Sabin, 1959, roughly developed an oral vaccine that replaced the injection vaccine until fairly recently, because it was easy to administer, easy to produce, and inexpensive. When you start to get down to very low levels of incidence, like the kind that Jim's groups are working against in Afghanistan, the older oral vaccine in some cases would have incidents of polio causing polio. And so they switched back in the 1990s to the injected Salk. I got in 1961 the injected Salk, and my brother, who's born in 1964, got the oral Sabin, and then my kids got the injected Salk. So it kind of been through a couple phases.
We're still getting in the United States, the injection is what we're using now. And every child is supposed to get it as part of their childhood vaccinations. They're supposed to. Yeah.
We get a lot of, on history of vaccines, we get a lot of emails from people remembering the sugar cube and asking, you know, but you have the story about the Salk vaccine, and that's the vaccine that I got, but I remember a sugar cube. It's like, no, it's the Sabin. And so then I asked him when they got it, and it's like, oh, in 1960, 1959, 1960, 61. It's like, no, it was you got the Sabin, not the Salk. And they seem a little disappointed that they were not in the trials, in the original trials.
So with the success of polio basically eradicating the United States, is there any move to stop vaccinating children for polio in the U.S.?
No, I hope not.
It's still part of the protocol regimen of vaccinations? Like smallpox has disappeared. We no longer give smallpox vaccines.
Yeah, until it is completely eradicated, and then a little bit after that, then it'll probably come off the schedule. But as long as one single person in the world has it, they're very capable of starting an epidemic, and so you don't want to take that risk.
Yeah. So my question,
we expect
Jim and Carl, is: so when you go into Afghanistan and places like this, and in the U.S., there's a schedule. I think there's like 4 different injections to create immunity. So how are you tracking kids, or what you're giving in these other countries? Is it a 1-dose thing?
No, it takes 2 doses to really guarantee.
And it has to be so far apart, right?
No, not necessarily. I can't remember what, Carl, you probably know how far apart they have to be. One of the ways they track it, every kid that gets in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in fact, around the world when they're getting it, they get a little purple paint on that's hard to take off on their finger. But it's more importantly, PolioPlus infrastructure has done a really, really good job of figuring out who these people are and whether or not those kids are actually getting it.
Okay. Because I was saying that would be a huge challenge, especially in countries like India, where not everybody even speaks the same language, to keep track of all those people.
India's an amazing story.
That's why every 6 months they have another NID and give it to the same kids, because how would you know?
Yeah.
Right. Which is why we have to keep on doing it every year. And in fact, there's some estimates we probably will have to continue the oral polio vaccine in a lot of these areas for 10 years after it's declared, after the world is declared.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
So we're close, but we're not that
Yeah. It takes 3 years with no cases for World Health Organization to give us certification of being polio free, as they did in Africa recently. But then we have to continue on for about 10 years to really do what smallpox has been done.
Okay.
I think this is another separate thing, but I understand that actually some of our troops that are going to be overseas are actually being given smallpox vaccinations even to this day.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, that's a whole other subject that we can have.
Make another evening.
There's stockpiles of smallpox still being held in 2 laboratories in the world that we know of, and so yeah.
That's a different program.
Oh yes, much different.
Yeah. Let's see. Any other questions that
Let's see. Did y'all see my? Yeah, there. I want to make sure it's in there.
Yeah. So I've been asked. It's like, so with so much information, like you spoke to, Jim, about the Taliban floating around about vaccines and COVID and everything else, what lessons or stories from the eradication or the near eradication of poliovirus do you feel like could help us today with COVID?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
Well, what lessons can we take with our eradication of polio that we can then move forward with it with COVID, and anything you would suggest that would help people participate in the eradication or at least the control of COVID?
Well, I think that the message needs to be to continue to do the proper things that you would do, that we would tell everybody: hand washing, wear your mask, stay socially distanced when you're told to. Trust the CDC. They've made I'd say 180-degree turnaround from over the last year or so, and they're getting the right information out. I don't know that I know the details of what they're upcoming with as far as getting kids back in school, but I do think the message that we even try to spread in these endemic countries is that same message. You've got to keep things clean if you're going to have the vaccine do the job it needs to be done. So that's the, oh, I just noticed I misspelled. I gave you the wrong number. My phone number, it's 20005.
That's awfully generous of you to share your phone number on it.
Well,
There's
there's an extra 9 in there. It's 913-200-0514. Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Mhm.
All right. Well, it is 8:18 and we have gone over a little bit. I think it's time for us to say thank you very much to our panelists. Is there anything else here? Oh, yes, I need to tell you about our next program. There we go. All right. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, so thank you to all of our panelists. So our final program, we've been in this We've Been Here Before series. So our final program is called And Here We Are Now. So we have talked about the 1918 pandemic and polio, and now we're in the midst of conquering COVID-19 with mass vaccination. Information about the virus and vaccines have been confusing since the pandemic began over a year ago. So please join us. We're going to talk with Dr. Lee Norman. He's the director of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and Dr. Sabato Cecilio, he is a pulmonologist and medical director at Providence Medical Center, and Dr. Prashant Katrapati, he is a cardiologist and medical director at St. John Hospital. The doctors will be discussing the latest information on the vaccine rollout in Kansas and the medical concerns that people have about the virus and the vaccine. And that program will be on Wednesday, April 21st at 7 o'clock. And there we have the link, the Zoom link for the program is in chat right now, but you will be able to get that from your local libraries too, closer to the program. So if you don't want to take it down right now, we will certainly have that on our websites and our social media. So I think we're done. Thank you very much, doctors. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Carl. Wonderful program, great information. And thank you everyone for attending, and have a nice night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for the invitation.